Curating a memorial for someone as renowned and multi-talented as David Rakoff is a daunting proposition. For that reason, we dedicate this evening particularly to who David was to our MFA program, what he meant to us as a family of writers. The first time I heard David read was the summer of 2006. My husband and I had just moved here from California, and the program had just become part of Stony Brook University. I realized I was in the presence of one of those New York writers I'd heard so much about. As David delivered his whip-sharp rant on Barbara Bush, I felt him in my viscera. What enviable freedom, what punching dexterity. When asked how he becomes so free, he answered simply, lots of therapy. It makes sense that his essay, All the Time We Have, about the death of his therapist, later became the inspiration for the Ink on Shrink series here in Manhattan. As this evening unfolds, we'll see a bit of this reading and other readings of David's on writing and the writing life. As a program, we had the honor of offering David his first ever teaching job in our old building on 28th Street. Helping David get his classroom set up, I learned that despite being a famous writer, in the thick of chemotherapy and between surgeries, David would never forget the humbling lessons he'd learned as a former assistant, which meant he did all his own Xeroxing, brought snacks to share at every class, and was the least high-maintenance person I've ever worked with. We got him to leave Manhattan and come out to teach a workshop in Southampton during the summer conference. Although, as Bob Reeves likes to say, David thought of Southampton as the wilderness. After a day by the beach in front of the Sillerman's home, David actually said to me, I had no idea it would be this beautiful. As a teacher, David was absolutely, as he said, gobsmacked by one of his students, and generous as always, he did everything he could to help her get published. Here to introduce our first video clip, please welcome David's student, Carrie Cooper-Writer.
Magdalene asked me to read from an introduction that I gave to David's reading at Stony Brook a couple of years ago now, yes it was. But I'd like to preface it by saying that I was never David's roommate in college. I think, as I said before, I was never with him in band camp. I never had a meal with him, and certainly I never, as so many did with great affection, called him Davy. But I did call him mein lieber Professor David Rakoff, at least until I realized that it was not a German class. It was, in fact, familial essay. I've clocked a lot of miles, both as a student and a teacher in another field. It's right past that red barn in Southampton. You know the one I'm talking about? Well, anyway. You take a left, you go past the cow manure, and that's my field. Anyway, I therefore think that I know a good teacher when I see one. And David certainly was that. I was once told that the essence of good teaching is to not be condescending. And David certainly was not that. He was gracious as he was in all aspects of his life, by all evidence. And he was, in the sense that all good teachers are, a parent of a kind. The best teachers, I think, are able to see something in their students that perhaps their actual parents didn't have the resources to see, or the time, or the knowledge to nurture. And if David is my literary father, then of course I do have a literary mother, and that is Patty Marks, who's here tonight. The two of them schemed together to introduce me to people, and I'm sorry, Patty, that pegs you as an unwed mother. That's not nice. But if you don't care, I don't care. Just please don't talk to me when I'm with my friends, okay? But no, it's cool. They're cool. Although inevitably all individuals must be spoken of in the past, their creations remain in the present. And so, in the present tense, I would like to describe David's writing. I think of David's writing in terms of light as illumination. And wherever brilliant light plays on a subject, there's a corresponding depth of shadow. Like Blake's tiger, David's writing shines more brightly for being placed in the forest of the night. His books are grounded in self-awareness, but his real subject is not autobiography so much as his profoundly insightful involvement with the world at large, expressed in a complete spectrum from humor to sadness. For their author's clear-eyed skepticism, formidable intelligence and wit, compassionate humanism that refuses to countenance blatant wrong-headedness, aka Barbara Bush for one, David's books deserve our attention, deserve to live on. They are a reminder, too, of the man. Every page is evidence that we are reading the words of, as they say in at least one of my countries, un mensch total. Thank you.
Each morning begins suffused with this sense of privilege, shell pink, and pulsing with new hope. The terrors and agitations of the night fade away, and here it is, the clean expanse that is 6 a.m., free of almost anything but promise. Caffeination, evacuation, ablution, through all of which I spool out lovely and eloquent paragraphs in my head. And so to the gym, where the lungs take in the new air and the fresh blood courses, and look, here it is barely 8:30. You'll be home and at your desk, scribbling away before other folks have even gotten to work. What grandiose hopes for the deathless prose that will be hoiked up from your depths, taking as evidence the sentences that flow easily through the mind as you do your crunches, the language graceful, propelled forward by the power of its own logic, a slinky waterfalling effortlessly down a staircase. The toddlers of the daycare center next door are delivered. The carousing teenagers from the high school across the street deposit their cell phones and dime bags into the shrubbery by the stoop and line up for the metal detectors. The computer is turned on, opening up the file left the day before. Today will be good, you think. Not like the previous day's lack of industry, a shameful waste of phone calls, emails, snacking, and onanism. Yes, it is all about today. But first, the crossword. And what does Paul Krugman have to say? Oh, that Gail Collins. Love her. Email, has it been checked in the last 40 seconds? And now a snack. A friend calls. She can't settle either. Midday already? The toddlers now screaming are picked up from next door. Sit down and write a sentence, for God's sake. One fucking sentence. It won't kill you. It almost kills you. Funny thing about words, regarded individually or encountered in newspapers or books written by other people, they are as lovely and blameless as talcum sweet babies. String them together into a sentence of your own, however, and these cooing infants become a savage gang straight out of Lord of the Flies. A sullen coven with neither conscience nor allegiance. It will take the civilizing influence of repeated revision to whip them into shape, an exhausting prospect. Time for that late afternoon power nap. 10 minutes is all I need, and then I'm good for the rest of the day, you brag to anyone who cares to listen. You rise refreshed, your sense of creative optimism restored, or it would be if it wasn't for the maniac crinkling that cellophane wrapper. Who the hell does he think he is? Stand at the window, scan the sidewalk like a crazy person. Uh-oh. Here comes that bitch with her schnauzers again. Log on to the dog beat site and wait yet again and see how long the average lifespan is for such a creature. How much Xanax crushed up into some ground beef would it take? Never mind. Sit back down. And nothing. Whither flown the clarity of those morning insights? How many times must it be demonstrated to you that the interval of genius is as thin and fragile as the skin of an onion, if not downright illusory? And yet you never rush to the desk to get the pearls down on paper, because in the moment of thought they seem incapable of dissipation. So immortal, so solid in their reasoning, like those musings just before dropping off to sleep. Why disturb this almost slumber by writing? The Brooklyn Bridge doesn't simply crumble because one's gaze has shifted from it. Of course I'll remember something that is obviously axiomatic and brilliant in the morning. Might as well finish eating that dried mango. Oh, Google, how does one make soap?
Let me show you something. This is the first paragraph of David's essay, I'll Take the Low Road. And the reason I'd like to read you this beginning is to suggest that David's essays build their endings into their beginnings, displaying the complete moral and artistic integrity of his life. This is from I'll Take the Low Road. The very unshaven young priest from Italy on the train up to northern Scotland has the handsome, tormented look of a defrocked cleric from the Sika neorealist flick. He wears the uneasy countenance of a man made to question his beliefs, having tasted the apostate joys of, say, carnal love with a beautiful widow. Or perhaps his anguished expression is the result of the egg mayonnaise sandwiches in the dining carriage. To avert just such a crisis of faith, I brought my own sopretta and cheddar on rye. Sopressata and cheddar on rye, much to the delight of the seeing eye dog, who immediately goes rooting through the bag of food I have placed at my feet. He's not making your lunch, then, is he? Asked the dog's owner, seated beside me. Well, he would know if his dog was making my lunch because he turns out to be one of those very special blind men who can actually see. Whatever his visual impairment, it must be minimal because no joke. He spends the entire train journey reading and writing voluminous notes on the rules of conduct for some sort of tournament. The handwriting is better than mine, so it makes me wonder if I perhaps am witnessing an Eastern miracle right here on British Rail. I'm not wishing to get all literary and shit about this opening, something David would call getting all literary and shit. Let's just say that writing like this does everything good writing should. It makes us see, laugh, get it, and it makes us dream into life. It is what David is about. I think he is very tough, always giving better than he gets. But above the fray, he sees the world as a work of the imagination for good and not so good. When, as in this piece, he guesses how people are feeling or thinking, it isn't a guess. The witty writer. How does one deal with the witty writer? If David were only and merely witty, the answer simply would be to chuckle and congratulate him, since he is so much more than witty, since his bottomless decency and sense of honor select and shape every subject he writes about. To call him witty is an evasion born of embarrassment. The truth is, David is too good for us, too good, too knowing, too kind, too generous, too right. Wit is his Halloween outfit that keeps us from watching him weep. His anxieties, his outrage, his loves are ours. I use the present tense to talk about him, not because I wish to bring him back to life, who does not, but rather because he never left. David occupies a permanent present tense as a person and as a writer. I'll take the low road. Did he make that stuff up? How will we know if there ever was a very unshaven priest who ate mayonnaise sandwiches and questioned his vows? How will we know that David just planted there to cooperate with the so-called Eastern miracle of seeing the blind man see? And how will we know that he existed either? Bullshit, possibly, sublime bullshit. All this probably happened. Great accidents happen to great writers, but who cares? All that is miraculous, ridiculous, magical, and murderous in our life comes before David, and he makes it sing. Which brings us back to his beginning and his ending and his monumental moral stature. Titles aside, the fact is that David always and only takes the high road. He was born on it. Even when he is drawn to get down and dirty by the likes of Barbara Bush, his perch of attack is a nobleman's. Were he capable of narcissism, he would appreciate the magnitude of his own loss. But as ever, he thinks more of us than of himself. Only one who imagines the world so clearly could simultaneously scold it and embrace it. Of his illness and inevitable death, David writes in another essay, of an armless veteran of the Great War standing in a parade. Will I manage a similar elegance and dignity, he asks. Is he kidding?
I feel like that's the best, most dramatic way to begin is with the crackling of your water bottle. I am going to read a couple poems that David liked. And they like his written work and his acting and directing and radio voice and presence make him live a little bit longer for me. So this is just something that he tossed off when we were talking about the usual thing of like, how do you live? How do you go through every day? How do you do it? So this is called You Want a Social Life with Friends by Kenneth Koch. You want a social life with friends, a passionate love life, and as well to work hard every day. What's true is of these three you may have two, and two can pay you dividends, but never may have three. There isn't time enough, my friends, though dawn begins, yet midnight ends, to find the time to have love, work, and friends. Michelangelo had feeling for Vittorio and the ceiling, but did he go to parties at day's end? Homer nightly went to banquets, wrote all day, but had no lockets, bright with pictures of his girl. I know one who loves and parties and has done so since his 30s, but writes hardly anything at all. And this is just, David used this poem for his own purposes, which I'm going to read something that he wrote about it after I read this poem, which I'm not really qualified to do. It's Letter to New York by Elizabeth Bishop. In your next letter, I wish you'd say where you are going and what you are doing. How are the plays, and after the plays, what other pleasures you're pursuing? Taking cabs in the middle of the night, driving as if to save your soul, where the road goes round and round the park, and the meter glares like a moral owl. And the trees look so queer and green, standing alone in big black caves, and suddenly you're in a different place where everything seems to happen in waves. Most of the jokes you just can't catch, like dirty words rubbed off a slate. And the songs are loud but somehow dim, and it gets so terribly late. And coming out of the brownstone house to the gray sidewalk, the watered street, one side of the building rises with the sun like a glistening field of wheat. Wheat, not oats, dear, I'm afraid. If it's wheat, it's none of your sowing. Nevertheless, I'd like to know what you are doing and where you are going. And this is what David wrote about this poem. I have been using Elizabeth Bishop's Letter to New York for the last few years just as reliantly and regularly as I take aspirin for headaches. Every few weeks or so, I have an MRI to check on a tumor that has tenaciously nestled itself behind my collarbone. The hope of each scan is that the chemotherapy I'm regularly receiving is working, and the mass is getting smaller, and my brilliant surgeon will soon be able to work her magic without having to amputate my arm. Letter to New York is perfect for the coffin. That is what the MRI is, make no mistake. To the adept claustrophobe, all these assurances that the machine is a brilliant life-saving diagnostic marvel are nothing but noise when confronted with a ceiling scarcely 4 inches from one's face. To open your eyes, I hardly need advise you, would be a grievous mistake. In addition, it is vital not to start reciting too early. To do so would rob the poem of its calming analgesic power. It is not until I have undressed and divested my body of all metal and put on my hospital gown, not until the tranquilizer has started to kick in and my breathing has become less ragged and more cello-like, and I am on the slab being scanned, that I begin my incantation. To be sure, the contents of Bishop's lines is secondary to the busy work of recitation. It is in the task where the distracting meditative cure lies. But then, from out of the darkness, comes the barely seen flashes of meaning, like the nighttime trees of Central Park whizzing past a taxi window, or the half-heard innuendo struggling through the muzzy din of some after-hours joint. Lying on the table, it can sometimes feel like I've been in treatment longer than I've been alive, that my world has contracted and been bricked over, and this is who I am and will only ever be. There is solace in the poem's portrait of New York City, my home for close to 3 decades. It's a New York not just of my healthier, but of my younger self. And it's nice to think of it all still being there, waiting for me, just as soon as I get up and walk out of this room.
Sigh. Should you happen to be possessed of a certain verbal acuity coupled with a relentless hair-trigger humor and surface cheer spackling over a chronic melancholia and loneliness, a grotesquely caricatured version of your deepest self which you trot out at the slightest provocation to endearing and glib comic effect, thus rendering you the kind of fellow who is beloved by all yet loved by none, all of it to distract, however fleetingly, from the cold and dead-faced truth that with each passing year you face the unavoidable certainty of a solitary future in which you will one day perish while vainly attempting the Heimlich maneuver on yourself in the back of the kitchen chair, then this confirmation that you have triumphed again and managed to gull yet another mark, except this time it was the one person you'd hoped might be immune to your ever creakier, puddle-shallow, sideshow Barker version of adorable, even though you'd been launching this campaign weekly with a single-minded determination from day one. Well, it conjures up feelings that are best described as mixed.
That single sentence is an excerpt from All the Time We Have, an essay from Half Empty on the passing of David's therapist, which David read for the first time in Southampton in the summer of 2011. I was fortunate to be there to hear it. After the reading, Billy Collins remarked that he was going to have his students diagram that paragraph. Roger Rosenblatt was inspired to read a piece on the family therapist who worked with Roger and Ginny and their grandkids after the death of their daughter and mother. And it was also the inspiration for Ink on Shrinks, a very popular reading series hosted here at Stony Brook, Manhattan. At that point in the essay, David was about to terminate therapy, and Mel, the therapist, has said that he's going to miss David, indicating that he'd like to at least meet him once a week for coffee. David asks if Mel feels that way about all his patients after they terminate. And Mel says, no. So if we could put that up, I just want to say a few words about it. And I feel if any preacher ever preached to any choir, this is the most choiristic thing. You're going to know everything that I say, I suspect. But I mean, it's just look at a few aspects of this thing. Should you happen to be possessed? That's weird if you think about it. First of all, he's talking about himself, but he says you. And second, there's a triple conditional there. Should you happen to be passive voice possessed? So it's very self-effacing. It's as if his wit, which is what he's talking about, were something that came from the outside and sort of possessed him. And then you look a little further down, and you see buried in the long, beautifully structured sentence, 2 or 3 sort of kernels. One, and when you heard him read it, you heard him bury the first one, who is beloved by all, yet loved by none. He's talking about himself. So you begin to feel the melancholia here, and one of the few times David was wrong, the mistake he's making, and the mistake that sort of corrects itself by the very existence of the paragraph. Then if you go down a little bit further, I think well, first of all, you see all these words that are very Latinate, like provocation, unavoidable, certainty, solitary, even future, attempting, and so on. But they're all mixed in with Anglo-Saxon words. They're all like a mishmash of the 2 great streams that make our language. And that, for me, is one of the most beautiful things about David's writing. He will bring you up short with the second kernel, manage to gull yet another mark. Now, those are Shakespearean words. They're not from Caesar or any Latin person. So you have this kind of, what he does is he sort of tumbles along and with somewhat multisyllabic words, and then he brings you up short with gull a mark. So he's saying that he fooled his therapist into liking him. And the therapist says no, he doesn't say that he wants to have coffee with everybody, just him. And he feels like he's put something over on the therapist. We know he's wrong. And the fact that he uses the word adorable about himself in quotes, very pejoratively, or as the British would say, and as David might say, pejoratively, the very fact that he uses that word as if to disavow any other appeal he may have had for us makes him, in a way, dead wrong. And if he actually thought that, it makes me very sad. I don't believe he did. I think ultimately he knew how loved he was, and I think ultimately we knew that he knew it. And so I read this as a kind of little mini autobiography in a way, and filled with his wit, humor, a certain melancholia, as he says, but ultimately, thank God, mistaken.
So that segues really perfectly into a little snippet I wanted to give you from David Rakoff's workshop assignment. When he was teaching at Southampton, he would draft a workshop assignment, and most people wrote a sentence that said something like, "Welcome to my workshop, we'll be studying poetry." And so he wrote a whole page, impassioned. I mean, he cared about the one thing of having something interesting to say. So his opening gambit for his workshop assignment is, "The familiar essay had its heyday in the 19th century, but is crying out for rebirth, especially given the suffocating ubiquity
of the personal essay. Familiar essays may well begin with the personal, but they broaden to the universal. So I have an example from in our very first issue of the Southampton Review, so ably edited by Lou Ann Walker. We have a retrospective of Woody Allen's work that David did for the issue. And this is at the very end. He's arrived at the film Manhattan. He's describing a moment in time when he was a junior on his semester abroad, and he got a job during the winter break at Shakespeare and Company in Paris, and they let him sleep upstairs. So I was, sorry, how authentic, how bohemian, how ridiculously cool it all seemed. Until one day, in walked a boy with whom I went to college. Staring into his flawless face, or at the brilliance of the white broadcloth of his perfectly rumpled Oxford shirt, was like looking directly at the blazing sun. Even his name, Mark Marvel, his real name, seemed to perfectly evoke that whole mid-'80s new romantic brideshead thing he had going. Did you go to Columbia? Small world, we mutually declared. So, what are you going to do for the holiday? He asked me. Do, I thought. Aren't I already doing it? I'm here in Paris, working in a bookstore, smoking cigarettes, sleeping upstairs under a coverlet of navy velvet, a midnight sky festooned with a Milky Way of dander. I didn't understand the question. Why? What was he doing? Oh, I'm going to Sardinia to see my friend Isabel Fonseca. Do you know her? I bought her this bottle of brandy. Brandy? How did he know about brandy? That same year, I had walked into a liquor store in London looking for a hostess gift. It said that I wanted a nice bottle of something brown, maybe some good gin, I inquired. What did I know? I didn't learn how to drink until years later when hatred of my job in publishing essentially medically required it. As for Sardinia, I was at sea. I knew it was near Sicily, but briefly confused it with Corsica as Napoleon's birthplace. And there it was, all over again. The girls of 17 magazine, Mark Marvel, Mariel Hemingway's hair, all of it conspiring and leading me to that same conclusion that so often rings in my head, the referendum on the ways in which I am found wanting, leading to the chronic conclusion I shall never catch up. As I've gotten older and the race is no longer open to 42-year-olds, I've simply replaced the word catch with measure. And it has worked just as well. I still hope I get to live in Manhattan when I grow up.
Speaking about mourning for David reminds me of that bumper sticker that was so popular in the 60s. Waging war for peace is like screwing for virginity. It should be impossible to bring grieving to the memory of such celebration, and difficult to speak of desolation when David was about elation. And can there be tears after so much laughter? Well, of course there can, but it is a contradiction, isn't it? So, impeded by this confusion, we turn to the clearer minds of those who have come before. Here is part 3 of W.H. Audubon's tribute to William Butler Yeats. Its form echoes a form at which, no surprise, David was adept. Auden on Yeats. Earth, receive an honored guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poetry. Time that is intolerant of brave and of the innocent, and indifferent in a week to a beautiful physique, worships language and forgives everyone by whom it lives, pardons cowardice, conceit, lays its honors at their feet. Time that with this strange excuse pardoned Kipling and his views, and will pardon Paul Claudel, pardons him for writing well. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie locked and frozen in each eye. Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the forming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. David was a healing fountain. It will never run dry.
David first came to our programs through Melissa Bank. She said she adored him and that we would adore him, and I trust Melissa completely in matters such as who is a perfect fit for our group. This was about 6 years ago. David first taught with Patty Marks, team teaching a workshop in writing funny, which may have been pound for pound the funniest faculty for a single course of all time. Early on, as Magdalene mentioned, David thought of Southampton as the wilderness. And I still cringe when I recall that we first housed him in a bed and breakfast, which, of course, unless he were on assignment, would have been kind of torture. But he did not complain. But he grew to enjoy Southampton, to look forward to his time there, and I think he felt what we are known for, which we call the Big Love. After having visitor status for 3 years, he officially joined the faculty about 3 years after that. This had something to do with learning about our Manhattan location. He could teach in the city and the neighborhood he loved, and then make these forays into the wilderness. I'm going to read 2 paragraphs, one funny and one sad. As we've been saying, David was take your breath away hilarious, and as we've been saying, his wit could be put in service as a weapon with devastating effect, deadly assault by other means, but mostly used in self-defense and when provoked. And what provoked him was pretension, arrogance, injustices, large and small, simple unfairness, and I think most of all, cruelty. And on these occasions, you did not want to be on the wrong end of David's lethal wit. Here's an example of 4 sentences, a setup, a pivot, and the annihilation. And by the way, David's first reading for us. And the photograph at the rear there, where you see 6 years, that was the occasion there with Melissa Bank and Matt Clam. The occasion, that was either before or after his first reading for us. But someone in the audience during Q&A, actually requested that he read a particular sentence, which is nothing that's happened in the Q&A that I'm aware of before or since. But this is about an encounter with Karl Lagerfeld. All of the designers I have met up to this point have been very nice, although upon being introduced to Karl Lagerfeld, he looks me up and down and dismisses me with the not super kind, "What can you write that hasn't been written already?" So there's a little bit of rudeness. He's absolutely right. I have no idea. I can but try. The only thing I can come up with right now is that Lagerfeld's powdered white ponytail has dusted the shoulders of his suit with what looks like dandruff but isn't. Seated on a tiny velvet chair with his large doughy rump dominating the miniature piece of furniture like a loose, flabby, ass-flavored muffin over-risen from its pan, he resembles a Daumier caricature of some corpulent, overfed, inhumane oligarch drawn sitting on a commode, stuffing his greedy throat with the corpses of dead children. While from his other end, he ships out huge, malodorous piles of tainted money. How's that for new and ground? Now for the sad paragraph. Madeline earlier recalled when David officially joined the faculty. I will now mention how he left us. Among his friends, certainly David's reputation for not wanting to be a bother, not wanting to make a fuss, not wanting to be difficult, was legendary. Promise me this is not typical among faculty. This past summer, he was slated to teach his workshop of the familiar essay. His illness was overtaking him, and when he learned he could not meet this obligation, he sent the following email to me and to Magdalene. It is very difficult to read, and I think he also intended it for our group. That's why I share it. The email is the occasion of his resignation. Subject line is, "Oh my dears, please forgive me in advance. I'm writing from one day after my procedure where they very kindly stuck a needle in my side and removed close to a liter of fluid from my pleura, making it nigh on impossible to breathe. If pressed, I'd have to say I'm entering the palliative stage of my illness, and alas, the big show. I'm no longer well enough to teach, I'm afraid, and so must make my apologies for the summer workshop, but also in the larger scheme, I ask that you respectfully accept my resignation herewith. One practical matter that needs to be addressed. You guys have paid me a shitload of money for which I've done not a lick of work. I'd like to reimburse you in some way. Please let me know about how we can affect that. If it is possible to smile here, it is the irony that, as all of our faculty know, I did not pay him a shitload of money. Although, God, if I had it to do over. And I think the two paragraphs go together in that David used his wit to attack cruelty, the pretension of the Lagerfeld, and his life itself was on the opposite end of the spectrum. His life was an enduring and epic emblem of generosity, of selflessness and kindness.
This was initially written in 1999 for a series that the New York Times was doing called Writers on Writing. It never ran. I mean, they discontinued the series before I could get it to them. Behold the writer on writing. Oh, how that very question, how does the writer write, rings in my ears unasked, but clearly etched across the eager faces of the steady stream of hopeful young acolytes who make the long trip up here to my little outpost in the Berkshires. Please, they seem to beseech, what alchemy, what ethereal fire transforms our wordy soup of glottals and fricatives into language, and that language into writing, your writing, Mr. Rakoff? Why even attempt an answer when so few truly agree what constitutes writing? Surely the act is not merely confined to those moments when pen is taken in hand, digit raps against typewriter key, or in my case, when I speak into my cunning little recorder, or dictate aloud to Caitlin, amanuensis in excelsis extraordinaria, whom I plucked, lo, those many years ago from that fiction colloquium at the New School. Caitlin, remind me about the blurb for Toby Wolfe. Do not leave the house this evening without making me come up with something. All is writing, I tell them. And of course, writing is all, I also tell them. For me, the writing of my day begins the very instant I open my eyes, even before, perhaps, when I sleepily hear my wife, Jane, pathological early riser that she is, get up to dress and start breakfast. A writer's cortex kicks into gear even then. On cold mornings, that calming interval of staying warm among the labial folds of my eiderdown, the only sounds being the hiss of the wood-burning stove in the kitchen and the regular whack-whack of Jane as she chops more wood outside. That too is writing. Don't let anyone tell you different. Winter comes early to these parts. Autumn's end is signaled by the grackles, ludic brigands laying waste to the damson plum in the yard. Once, funny, sitting in my Nakashima chair in my study, I watched for hours as Jane tried to wrap the off-stripped fruit tree in meter upon meter of protective plastic sheeting. How many times did she fall from the ladder in her efforts that day? Gone, strange, the details that evade memory. Above all, the writer must write for himself. Accolades and external laurels can be lovely, but proven wanting in the end if the inner yearning to write and write and write and write is lacking. No sooner had we moved up here than, for example, Jane talk of her National Book Award nomination for poetry and the attendant vicious gossip about the jealousies of the two artist couple still buzzing on the carrion-glazed lips of that pack of vultures we call the literary establishment. She stopped writing almost entirely. I always wondered at her much professed time constraints. Was it a flagging desire, perhaps? After all, I often told her, writers write. Oh, larkspur, oh, hawthorn.
That was one of the launches of TSR, Southampton Review, that reading at Stony Brook, Southampton. And David was incredibly generous to the Southampton Review, to TSR. Visual? When it was time for the very first issue, I asked him to submit something, and he immediately turned it over. Something, he had no idea that it wouldn't be written on toilet paper. He had no idea what it was going to be, but he had complete faith and was very generous in that way. So he was in volume 1, number 1, and he read at 2 different TSR launches. After my husband died, one of the first messages I got from anyone was an email from David, and I barely knew him really at that point. And what was striking about it was, in the middle of the email, he said, "I hope you have people around you." And David was somebody who was the consummate friend to everyone, and that love David on that email meant so much to me. And as a result of David's devotion to us, we want to dedicate the next issue of TSR, the Southampton Review, to David. It will be the start
ironic wit issue, the serio-comedic tragic issue, the acerbic, more dry, shaken, stirred wit issue. We're just going to be featuring works by friends of David, some of the art that David produced wonderfully for his friends, the little sculpted heads and the collage boxes, all that sort of thing. So if you have anything you know that you would like to see that's about David, let me know, and thank you.
I had the pleasure of teaching last year in the Florence program in the winter, and I was so excited because David was going to be teaching there too, but he wasn't able to go. And I was really, really looking forward to going to the academia and seeing the statue of David, but I have to say, I went anyway, but it didn't remotely make up for the real David. But I do have a happy thing that happened with David. I was a judge last year of the Thurber Prize, and David was a finalist and won the prize. And you know, when I think about Thurber and the Algonquin Round Table, the idea, like, wouldn't it have been incredible to sort of have been at the Algonquin Round Table with Dorothy Parker being really mean to you and falling down on the floor? Every writer's dream to be at the Algonquin Round Table, but I actually would much prefer to be at a table with David.
Of all the things that I admire David for, and I admire a lot, I think what stands out is that he stayed at that bed and breakfast. I lasted 5 minutes. I got on the phone. I have a friend. She has a really nice house. And I just left him there. And he did okay, I guess, but I don't know how he did. Another completely unrelated thing to writing about David, but I just think it's so ingenious. If you're ever in a restaurant and you want to look in back of you at somebody, but you don't want to be rude, David taught me what to do. I'm going to pass it on to you. You say, "Oh my God, I think I slipped on my neck the wrong way. Oh my God." And then you can just spy on somebody. Whenever David and I had lunch, we always spied on each other. Meg and I are going to read from David's last work, and it's quite a feat. It's a feat that he wrote it. He wrote it when he was really sick, and he finished it a few days, I mean, they would say literally a week before he died. It's just, and even if he hadn't been sick, it would be a feat that he wrote this. He mastered the familiar essay, and that wasn't enough. And he wrote a story in verse, and we're going to read it. I mean, David could do anything. It just, if he had lived, I think that he would have probably done erotica and Bible stories, and finally, I think a really great maritime tale. So for the setup, you don't need to know much. His books span the 20th century, so I'm going to go over the entire 20th century. No, this is toward the end, and it is the only 3 characters you have to know. Nathan is giving a wedding toast for his friends who are getting married, or ex-friends. His friend Josh was his best friend, and she is marrying Susan, his ex, and that's about all you need to know. That's going to be bad for you, but it's good for me. The book is called Love, Dishonor, Marry, Die, Perish, and David did some of those. That he had said yes was still a surprise. And not just to him, it was there in the eyes of the guests who had seen a mirage and drew near and then covered their shock with a, "Nathan, you're here." And then silence. They'd nothing to say beyond that. A few of the braver souls lingered to chat. They all knew it was neither a secret nor mystery that he and the couple had quite an odd history. Their bonds were a tangle of friendship and sex, Josh, his best pal once, and Susan, his ex. For a while, he could hardly go out in the city without being a punchline or an object of pity. Poor Nathan had virtually become his real name, and so he showed up just to show he was game. His shirt had been ironed, his belt brightly buckled, a shine on his shoes, a well-turned-out cuckold. Susan's sister was speaking, a princess in peach. Hello, I am Mindy, and this is my speech. Susan, you are the best sister. Plus, you've always had great comic timing. So I know you won't hold it against me when I do my specialty and make my toast in rhyming. You've always been a terrific runner, even though it made your shoes damp, especially when you were impersonating Mrs. Zoltik from Talmud Torah when we were at camp. Josh, we have become the best of friends, and I'm so happy now that I'm your sister. But when we go out together, let's try not to get blisters.
Nathan's mind wandered as Mindy meandered. The effort he'd squandered, if this was the standard, seemed hours badly wasted until he recalled that, time notwithstanding, he'd nothing at all. He'd pored over Bartlett's for couplets to filch. He'd stayed up till 3 and still came up with zilch. Except for instructions he'd underscored twice, just 2 words in length, and those words were, be nice. Too often he'd noticed emotions betray us, and reason departs once we're up on the dais. He'd witnessed uncomfortable moments where others had lost their way quickly, where sisters and brothers had gotten too prickly and peppered their babbling with stories of benders or lesbian dabbling, or spot-on impressions of mothers-in-law, which, true, Nathan thought, always garnered guffaws, but the price seemed too high, with the laugh seldom cloaking hostility, masquerading as joking.
No, he'd swallow his rage and bank all his fire. He knew that in his case the bar was set higher. He'd have to be careful and hide what his heart meant. Disingenuous malice was Susan's department. They'd be hungry for blood even though they had supped. Folks were just waiting for him to erupt in tears or some other sightly reaction, and Nathan would not give them that satisfaction. Though Susan a slattern and Josh was a lout, at least Nathan knew what he'd not talk about.
I won't wish them divorce, that they wither and sicken, or tonight that they choke on their salmon or chicken. I'll stay mum on that time when the cottage lost power, and that storm on the Cape, and they left for an hour, and they thought it was just the cleverest ruse to pretend it took that long to switch out the fuse. Or that time you advised me with so much insistence that I should be granting poor Susan more distance. That the worst I could do was to hamper and crowd her, that if she felt stifled, she'd just take a powder, that a plant needs its space just as much as its water, and above all, not give her the ring that I bought her, which in retrospect only elicits a gosh. I hardly deserved a friend like you, Josh.
No, I won't air that laundry or make myself foolish to satisfy appetites venal and ghoulish. I will not be the blot on this hellish affair. And with that, Nathan pushed out and rose from his chair. And just by the tapping of knife against crystal, all eyes turned his way, like he'd fired off a pistol.
Joshua, Susan, dear family and friends, a few words, if you will, before everything ends, and you skip out of here to begin your new life as happily married husband and wife. You've promised to honor, to love and obey. We've sipped our champagne and been cleansed with sorbet, all an endorsement of your hers and hisdom. So let me add my 2 cents worth of wisdom. Herewith as a coda to this evening historical, I just thought I'd tell you this tale allegorical.
I was racking my brains sitting here at this table until I remembered this suitable fable. Each reptilian hero Each animal's squeal serves a purpose, you see, because they reveal a truth about life, even as they distort us. So here is the tale of the scorpion and tortoise.
The scorpion was hamstrung, his tail all a quiver. Just how would he manage to get across the river? The water's so deep, he observed with a sigh, which pricked at the ears of the tortoise nearby. Well, why don't you swim? Asked the slow-moving fellow. Unless you're afraid, is it that, you yellow? That's rude, said the scorpion, and I'm not afraid so much as unable. It's not how I'm made.
Forgive me, I didn't mean to be glib when I said that. I figured you were an amphibian. The was one of misclassification. I mistakenly figured you for a crustacean.
No offense taken, the scorpion replied, but how about you help me to reach the far side? You swim like a dream, and you have what I lack. What say you take me across on your back?
I'm not really sure that's the best thing to do, said the tortoise. Now that I see that it's you. You're the scorpion, and how can I say this? Just, well, I don't know how I feel safe with you riding my shell. You've a less than ideal reputation preceding. There's talk of your victims all poisoned and bleeding. That fact by itself should be reason sufficient. I mean, what do you take me for, mentally deficient?
I hear what you're saying, but what would that prove? We both drowned. So tell me, how would that behoove me to basically die at my very own hand when all I desire is to be on dry land?
The tortoise considered the scorpion's defense. When he gave it some thought, it made perfect sense. The niggling voice in his mind he ignored, and he swam to the bank and called out, "Climb aboard."
The tortoise was wrong to ignore all his doubts, because in the end, friends, our true selves will out. For just a few moments from when they set sail, the scorpion lashed out with his venomous tail. The tortoise, too late, understood that he blundered when he felt his flesh stabbed and his carapace sundered. As he fought for his life, he said, "Please tell me why you have done this, for now we will both surely die."
"I don't know," cried the scorpion. "You never should trust a creature like me, because poison I must. I claim some remorse, or at least some compunction, but I just can't help it. My form is my function. You thought I'd behave like my cousin the crab, but unlike him, it is my nature to stab."
The tortoise expired with one final quiver, and then both of them sank, swallowed up by the river. Nathan paused, cleared his throat, took a sip of his drink. He needed these extra few seconds to think. The room had grown frosty, the tension was growing. Folks wondered precisely where Nathan was going. The prospects of skirting fiasco seemed dim, but what he said next surprised even him. So what can we learn from their watery ends? Is there some lesson on how to be friends? I think what it means is that central to living, a life that is good, is a life that's forgiving.
So wonderful to hear from his new book, and I'd like to thank Irene Skolnick for giving us the permissions to do so. I'd also like to thank Chip Cooper, who did these wonderful photographs of David here and David Patty in the back, and I think also the threesome, and also Star Black for taking pictures tonight. And I'd like to thank Carrie, and I have a list. Carrie, Roger, Melissa, Dan, Laura, Meg, and Patty for your participation. Susanna and Philip for doing all the editing, and Patrick Dunn for the flyers and everything else. Before I pass the baton back to Bob Reeves for a final announcement, I just want to read one more paragraph of David's. It was brought up at the Ink on Shrinks reading, and seeing Patty up here, one of the most wonderful things at that reading is David shouldn't have come, but he was so good. He had done chemo that day. He was really tired. He wouldn't let us down. And he did the reading sitting down. And Patty also read that night. And I have on the videotape the sound of David giggling at Patty in that high-pitched voice that he had. That was so like he couldn't bear how hard she made him laugh. It was just wonderful. So I just thought of that again when you were reading. This is again from the same story that Dan dissected. This is Dell, his therapist, has now died, and David has learned this and has had a final dream about Dell. And in the dream, he conflates Dell and himself. And suddenly there he is, only now he is a small boy, no older than 6, fresh from a bath, his black hair wet and combed. Between Dell and myself, only one of us had dark hair, and it isn't Dell. Wearing light blue pajamas, he climbs onto my lap. Look, he whispers, unbuttoning the jacket. The pale skin of his chest is marred by something, a tattoo or a wound or a scarification. Whichever it is clear this injury is a devotional mark incised for my benefit. It is a bruise of allegiance that would be carried forever. Bob?
As we adjourn this evening and perhaps reconvene nearby, I want you to know that we consider tonight not an ending, but a transition in the way we feel David's presence in our program. Poetry and art and love and friendship are often said to offer some consolation, a counterpoint to this dreadful operation of time. And I don't know that I believe that, but there's no real advantage in not pretending it is so. And you have already heard our plans for the Southampton Review, and I now leave you with this announcement. One of the many things that made David such a good fit with our faculty was his genius in multiple genres. Of course, there are the essays, the book you've just heard, also the screenplays and the directing and the acting and the envy-inducing radio voice. In Chancellor's Hall on the Southampton campus, the beautiful building that is home to our programs, where we hold the Writers' Conference and where David Rakoff taught, there is a final remaining space that requires renovation. We have long envisioned bringing it into a service as a flexible performance space that will advance the cause of a range of creative endeavors. There are readings, theater performances, open mic rehearsals, film screenings, and even film production work. In other words, it will be almost as versatile as David. So tonight I announce the organizing principle of that mission. We are beginning our efforts to bring to life the David Rakoff Studio Theater. And although the theater won't be in New York City, we hope that it will be for us what David was in Southampton, a light in the wilderness. I hope David would have enjoyed that gentle irony and given this project his blessing, and I hope he will join us in that effort. And with that, good night, and thank you all for coming.